This is Codified Wisdom. Sharp insights, no fluff, and real-world wisdom from leaders who want to get you further, faster. Now, here's your host, Eric Eager.
Well, hey, welcome back to Codified Wisdom. Hey, today, again, we are so blessed to have some phenomenal leaders that are sharing their experiences and their wisdom with us. And today's guest is a dear friend of mine, Patricia Asp. She's a senior executive, board member, advisor, and I've been amazed. Her transformation strategies has always been, I want to say groundbreaking, and PE firms have continued to ask, like, what's your magic? But she has held senior roles at Fortune 500 companies, including helping ServiceMaster, a $7 billion enterprise with over 5,000 locations. But, behind the impressive resume is a story of purpose, resilience, and just deep commitment to preserving what truly matters in businesses. And so after years in the corporate world, Pat, founded Aspire. It's a firm that helps companies codify and protect the values, purpose, and culture. It's a hardwire in the culture, especially during the times of change that we're going through right now. And especially when you got secessions, mergers, and all this rapid growth. Her mission is it's simple, but it's profound. Preserve the goodness inside of companies before it gets lost. So, hey, she's going to walk us through the defining moments, share some real life experiences. And I hope, again, like every week, my hope is that you take something away that you can apply to your business today. So, Pat, thanks for being on Codified Wisdom, and appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Eric, for having me.
Well, all right. Well, let's start like we do a lot of people, in that tell us about, where you grew up, and tell us kind of what shaped your values and your view of leadership even early in your life.
Well, it's not real sexy, Eric. Grew up on a dairy farm in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The youngest was 3. I have an older brother and older sister. My dad was an equal opportunity kind of guy before it was the law. So we all pitched in. That's where we learned teamwork, responsibility, duty. And eventually, when he would bring on people to hire and help us out during the summer, leadership, because we were the pace setters. We're getting things done. Now, our motivation wasn't as lofty. We just wanted to get done so we could get out of there and go have some fun. But it really exemplified not only the work ethic, the teamwork, the accountability and leadership, but my dad was of the mind that it would take years to build a good name, and it would take seconds to destroy it. And so that fundamental reputation based on behavior, it was really critical to him. And my mom, and just all are welcome. It was all people were to be treated with dignity and respect. Whether it was a hobo running around in the lower 40 that got invited to lunch, or some visiting dignitary from a foreign country to learn agricultural practices. Everybody got treated the same.
Well, in looking back, was there an experience or a belief in those early years that left a lasting mark today? Was there something, or was it a collective, just kind of every day of just reinforcing the family? Because as I understand it, it wasn't just your family, but you had aunts and uncles that were around your farm as well. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about having that kind of network system? And was there any person or experience that even helped leave a lasting mark on you, as you began your leadership journeys, we say?
I really believe, there was this thing, it takes a village. Well, our family is extremely close. And each person really invested in their nieces and nephews, and it wasn't really segmented. I mean, if you get in trouble, make a difference if your mom and dad were around, right? Aunts and uncles could do the same thing. Having that common value system, the common expectation of behavior was surrounding us growing up. And so even when I was well into my career, their attributes came out in my behavior. And it was recognized by my superiors, which was very interesting to me, who we kind of think, oh, it's the resume, it's the accomplishments, it's the titles.
Yeah.
When you find out someone said that, what made a positive impression was the fact that you made sure they got lunch when they arrived at your, which was my mother all over the place.
Wow. Well, obviously that left an impression, and I want to say that, it all started there, but as you started to, and you've shared with me your early stages of your professional career,
Mhm.
and you have such great, interesting stories. Tell us about some of the first roles, and especially, some of the cases where you're thrust into a situation, you know, didn't know, what you didn't know, and walk us through some of those kind of first experiences and the first stages of your professional path.
Well, as you know, I my first degrees in that were in the hospitality industry in dietetics. Did my internship over at Mayo Clinic, and came back, and because there was a shortage of registered dietitians, was approached to actually start my own consulting company to be able to help a chain of assisted living and nursing homes. Eventually joined a contract management company, which was acquired by ServiceMaster. And very interestingly, I always found myself in situations feeling like I was a size 5 in a size 10 job. And it really wasn't based on what I knew. It really was based on my ability to gain collaboration, to move forward with a solution to improve performance. And so I learned very early on, because I usually was the least experienced person in the room, that it wasn't going to be because I had the answers. It was going to be humble enough, but to be prepared to ask the questions and to discover a way forward to improve upon the end result. And so I think when you learn that early on, that you're not going to have all the answers, but you're going to feel not only comfortable enough, but humble enough to ask the questions.
And talk to us a little bit more, because I know that was a theme throughout your career. I mean, how did you, go to people and ask these questions and not have the confidence to ask those questions? Because, hey, when we're young and we're trying to move up the ranks, as you say, and impress our superiors on how much we know, was there ever the fear that, hey, I'm going to ask all these questions and they might figure out that, the imposter syndrome, they might figure out that I don't know what I'm doing here. And why is she asking all these questions? So how did you get around that?
The interesting thing, Eric, anybody can read your resume, right? They know you don't know. Either you don't have experience in the market or the industry, or, you're how old, you've got X number of experience. So you're not hiding anything from anyone by asking questions. But when done with respect, for those that were more experienced and continuing to really probe about, you need to move forward, you need to improve performance. And so it was a journey together, that it wasn't me trying to pretend that I knew, but I knew enough to know when there was going to be change and it was going to improve. But that everybody had to coalesce around that in order to have a team victory. And so it's always been treating people with dignity and respect, understanding they're more experienced than me. But I was the inquisitive, curious person that's saying, hey guys, we got to do something. Staying here isn't acceptable. And so it wasn't me saying it wasn't acceptable. It was either investors or customers or employees. So it was, rule one was define reality. And all leaders have to do that. And so once reality was defined, then we could move forward.
Well, and tell me a little bit more about, because you have such, and we don't have time today to go over all the life journeys and different stories of different events and different companies. But I just know in a couple of situations, like for example, the hospital, where there was always everybody was always, the food quality is horrible. No, you don't want hospital food. And, kind of talk us through that journey of just, and this is just one little snippet of, kind of questioning and staying focused on like the core levels of really what the business purpose was.
Well, the interesting thing was, it comes down to a question, right? It wasn't my question. I had hired someone from outside the industry, hadn't spent time in healthcare, was really in retail restaurants. And so he had come on board and we were touring one of our very large institutional kitchens. And anyone that's been in healthcare realizes that these big tray lines, that are in healthcare in order to assemble trays and meet all the dietary requirements and get all the trays up to the floor in the prescribed amount of meal. Right? And he asked the question, he walked in and he goes, "What's that?" And I said, "What's what?" And he said, "That." And he pointed to the tray line. I said, "Well, that's how we assemble all the trays and, all the diet requirements." And of course, it was extremely labor intensive, right? It was very labor. And so, and I said, how else would we get 600 trays up to the floor in an hour period of time? And he looked at me and he said, "Well, Pat, we do that every meal at the restaurant. We'll do 600 covers easily."
Wow.
Isn't that a lot of waste of labor, and that food is sitting there and but all he did was ask a question. "What is that?"
Wow.
Which led us to a total transformation of removing the tray line, putting the people taking orders right before service, and the acuity was so bad. I mean, patients were so sick, they didn't want what we had on the menu. They wanted toast or an egg or whatever. And so our food cost was reduced significantly. Labor costs about the same, but the floor supplies, which people were eating because they couldn't eat the meal because it was too big or not what they were hungry for, went down like by 90%. And our quality, and this was interesting, the survey that was taken for the quality of healthcare, the people that actually authored the survey contacted me and saying, "What in the world are you doing, Pat?" We're looking at the hospital results. We actually called the hospital and said, like, "Gee, are you sure this is right?" And where food service and housekeeping were always the lowest on the survey, we had popped right up to the top 10%.
Wow.
And it was basically having the empathy shown to the patient and their family that we cared enough to ensure about their nutritional status, which really came down to giving them something that they wanted to eat.
Wow. Wow. Well, and I know that was the basis of, as you began your career and began to move up and began getting into some pretty big, large organizations. And one of the things that it always impressed me in sharing our conversations, that you started to see patterns and started seeing that how could you build a culture with an organization. It's tough to do it with 50 people, much less, hundreds of thousands of people. Talk a little bit more of what you learned in that you started to codify things, as you've always taught me, and talked about. Tell me a little bit, like, when did that kind of uncover? When did you open up your eyes to, wait a minute, we could codify this. Maybe we can repeat this. This is something that we can do over and over again. Tell me a little bit about that story of how you came up with that.
Well, I think it was actually probably, if you look at a culmination of experiences where mistakes made, lesson learned, define. Mistakes made, lesson learned, define. And so you began to establish a process around any area that you would be inclined to see reoccurring mistakes, reoccurring shortfalls regarding quality, excellence, performance of finances. And so when you can take your experience and begin to unpack it to see what the catalyst was, what the reaction was, what the mistake was, the lesson, and define it. And define it in a way that it can be replicated, so that someone could pick that up and say, this is what a standard contract looks like. And these are areas you cannot change in a contract. Or if we're going to transform a food service department in healthcare, and they're all different. They all have different structures. They all have different layouts or whatever. How would you begin to define a process to transform? And you end up defining the questions that will be asked each time. They can be replicated. And so you begin to see red flags, clouds of caution, when you begin to look at data or numbers or situations that you can see, that you can forecast that this will break bad. Or, we need to stop now and not go any further. Or there's warnings. And usually the issue is when we learn from experience, we get the lesson after the mistake, right?
Yeah.
And then it's really when we look back that we can define and begin to see what the problem was, what the issue was, and the response to that, and where the mistake was made.
So you shared a story with me about you would bring salespeople in.
Mhm.
And as you brought salespeople in, it was, I want to say that you're the precursor to AI, because AI is a collection of wisdom and knowledge that everyone can tap into
Mhm.
if you know how to ask the right question. So share with me that, when did you start to go, wait a minute, how can we scale so that these new salespeople don't have to repeat the same hard lessons learned from prior salespeople?
Well, basically, it's collecting. It's it's collecting mistakes, right? Collecting mistakes, collecting lessons learned, and then communicating, training, developing people around those so they can learn from other people's mistakes. When you can do that, you basically increase the speed to proficiency so they don't have to make every mistake along the way. And if you really were to simplify contract management, for example, I mean, what are you doing? You're able to perform at a much higher level than your experience would dictate. Why? Because you're learning from other people. What is contract management? What is franchising?
Yeah.
I mean, all those things are really the collective wisdom of others that's been codified so it can be replicated.
Wow. Okay. Well, I hope our listeners, soak that in for a minute, because, so many of us, myself included, would make so many dumb mistakes. And then I would go and share it with friends, and they would go, Eric, why didn't you tell me that 2 years ago? I made the same mistake. And, um, and so at, leveraging and using that information, you were able to help participate and build a wonderful company.
Mhm.
And one of the things that you always share with me is kind of what led you to the next chapter, which
Mhm.
was, hey, all of us who are building companies, it is near and dear to our hearts that we all want to build great organizations and great people. But it's so easy, you know, because uh, you hear about mission, core values, and those kind of things. But how do you really know that the people are following it? How do you really know that it's going to survive with a change in management? It's going to survive an acquisition. Tell us a little bit more about what you're doing now with Aspire, and what your hopes it'll have on those listeners and businesses out there.
I think for me, it's been where I've been with companies or came in as CEO after someone sold their company to private equity. And you you learn that what the origin of the values and the culture has either been diluted or lost, either through rapid growth, mergers and acquisitions, succession planning. Uh, the growth may be that the new is bigger than the legacy business and kind of takes over. And so what I did is realize that in many organizations, the culture resides within the leadership, not within the business model. And so what I did was take my experience with Six Sigma, voice of the customer, voice of the employee, the service profit chain, and built a process and a system that could be hardwired into the business model, and in a way that A could be measured, because values can't be measured. Why? Because they're inanimate. So you need to move the value into behaviors that you expect to see evident when the values are being practiced, because behaviors can be measured. They can be observed and they can be heard. And that then the behaviors can get hardwired into your processes and systems so that they can be replicated. And therein lies the sustainability, because it's in the model, not within an individual. And because that can happen. I mean, as leaders, we're passionate about our values. We're passionate about the culture. But as your organization expands, even, when you look at what are the top, 4 values that are used in most corporations, it's either like integrity, respect, quality, whatever.
Yeah.
But those don't have operational definitions. So everybody walks around with different definitions in their mind.
Oh, wow.
To those words. And so if you're expecting alignment in a very diverse global operation, it behooves us to get an operational definition of what that means here. And here are the behaviors we expect to see evident when this value is being practiced. And so it codifies that which has for years, everybody said, oh, that's a soft skill. Well, guess what? It's usually what distinguishes the company in the marketplace. And so it's not soft. It's not soft.
Oh, wow.
It has to do with brand and reputation and customer service and investor relations.
So, it's always like, let's talk about that. Like every company you walk in and you'll see it on the wall. Here's our core values. Integrity is always on there.
Mhm.
But to your point, if you went around and talked to 50 team members, and what's integrity mean to you? How many answers would you get that would be consistent with one another? And I guess my question is also, well, okay, show that if I understand you right, it's wait a minute, you've demonstrated these types of behaviors. Those are measured and those demonstrate integrity. And now all of a sudden, everybody in the company knows
Right.
that, oh, when we mean integrity, it's like this and this and this and this. Now,
hardwired into your processes. When you look at how do we recruit people? How do we interview and hire people? How do we orientate and train people? How do we do performance reviews? What criteria do we use for promotions? What do our compensation schemes look like?
wow.
Begin then to have it hardwired right within the business model.
Well, and that piece of it that you just talked about, that doesn't seem like that I've got to go to a 6-month MBA, level. That seems so common sense. Do you find that it's hard to implement? If one listener today said, "Man, that just makes sense." How hard is it? How much training do you give people who are thinking about or want to do this in their company? How long an effort is this for them to learn how to do this?
To me, it's as simple as step 1, step 2, step 3. And what it takes is leadership commitment and intentionality. And to work within the team or organization, listen well, and begin to have it come through the funnel. And what are those critical few from a values perspective? And what are the critical few behaviors that go with each value after we've given it an operational definition? And where do we need to put it within all our processes and systems? So I had the honor of being with one of the very early executives in a company. And I always wanted to talk about the past to her, the history and that, and he wouldn't do it. He always said, no, I want to talk about the future. And he would start peppering me with questions. And then he said, the true sign of brilliance is simplicity.
You're right. You're right.
Not to make it complicated, not to make it, but to make it as simple as possible.
Wow. Well, as we begin to wrap things up, I always like to ask people, if there was magically a time machine and you could go back to the earlier in her career, Patricia, and you could then pass on some wisdom, something that you go, hey, don't do that because you're gonna make it's gonna burn a bunch of time. What wisdom would you pass on to yourself if you could go back in time and one event that would avoid making a bad mistake and would help you get further faster?
No, if it's so much from a career further faster, but the one thing that I have always learned was never to let anybody define me by labels. And today we live in a world of labels. And my perspective is, which is something my parents taught me years ago.
Yeah.
And has been embedded in my heart, is that all people are to be treated with dignity and respect, and they have inherent value. So it didn't make any difference. Are you hiring, disciplining, firing, whatever?
Yeah.
Whatever had happened, you still always remembered that the person in front of me is always to be treated with dignity and respect. And without labels. Without labels.
Wow. That's some wise advice. And in today's world, it's even more relevant probably than ever. So, well, I know that, Pat, we could have a whole series of talks. We just scratched the surface of all the things and the amazing things that you literally could go into companies and turn them around in 90 days. And all these other ways of hardwiring culture. But we'll have to do a follow-up podcast on, it's just hard to squeeze that much information in such a time frame. So, hey, I want to thank you for being on, Codified Wisdom. Again, our hope is that, hey, you pick up one or two things that helps people get further faster, for help them not have to make the same mistakes, that leverage that in something they could apply to right now. And so again, thank you. I humbly say, appreciate the advice and wisdom. And hey, everybody stay tuned for next week's episode. But for today, hey, again, thank you so much. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to Codified Wisdom with your host, Eric Eager. Want more? Subscribe and follow Codified Wisdom on YouTube, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. To learn more about Eric Eager and how 4Impact Data helps leaders get further, faster, visit 4impactdata.com.